Hello, and welcome to Introduction to Cognitive Science. Tonight we're going to be talking about concepts and beliefs. We're going to be fitting this into the general picture that we've been developing so far. So let's take a look at that picture. Well, if you'll recall, the picture so far divides the mind into two systems, System 1 and System 2. Now, what does it say about System 1? Well, it says there's an automatic and seemingly effortless System 1 that continually makes quick assessments which are passed along to System 2, which reflectively, effortfully, and using all relevant info makes choices and decides what to do and to accept. And we have said something more about System 1, namely, we've said that System 1 is a system that consists of hierarchically organized modules. And these modules are essentially simple algorithms that through computational transformation match incoming information. So for example, basic transduced sensation, such as information about the distribution of light on my retina. It matches this incoming information with proprietary assessments. So for example, EDGE. Sorry, I meant to say that the basic transduced sensations might be one kind of information that comes into a module, but there may be modules that are upstream from others, so they're going to include information that's been passed along in a kind of neural stream that's coming from downstream modules. Now, and we've also said something about these modules, specifically that they exhibit several distinctive properties, and that these properties explain the speed, automaticity, and other characteristic features of System 1. And these modular systems, or these modular assessments that are coming out of these modular systems, essentially constitute the input to System 2 or to our central processes. So such is our picture so far. Now, the focus for today is to look at what these modular assessments are like when they enter into System 2. So we'll be looking at what is the output of one particular set of modules, the modules that influence cognition and belief, or that contribute to cognition and belief. So we'll be talking about those. And we want to know essentially what happens to those modular system assessments after they enter System 2. So we're going to be talking about those things. Okay, so we first might ask, well, what are modular assessments like when they enter System 2? Or what is the information coming out of our modular systems like when it comes into System 2? What kind of information does System 2 get? And the starting point here might begin from a reflection that, well, look, if we go back to how Kahneman laid this all out for us, we're still building off of that basic picture. Similarly discussed this way in Karsten when she talks about central systems. The starting point will be that System 2 is us in a certain sense. That's our kind of conscious, the part of the mind that we experience as ourselves. So if we want to know what modular assessments are like when they enter into System 2, we may ask how we experience the world. And two key features, or two key kinds of aspects of our experience of the world stand out. So if we think about us seeing a dog, well, if I'm seeing a dog, they're basically, I mean, this is pretty roughshod, but we could say that there are like two primary ways in which we sort our experience of that dog. So one is phenomenal. Like if I look out in the world and I see a dog out there, I see aspects of that dog. I may see its color, I may hear its bark. I don't want to talk just about seeing or hearing. I may smell the dog, right? There are various different sensory impressions coming from the dog. And so I have this kind of sensory or phenomenal or qualitative, these are all words philosophers use to talk about conscious experience. I have this kind of felt experience of the dog. And then additionally, I have various kinds of beliefs. So I may look at this dog and form the belief, that it is a dog, or that it's a golden retriever, or so on. So today we're going to be talking primarily about the kind of cognitive piece and not the perceptual piece. So we'll be talking about this, the belief that there is a dog. What do those kinds of beliefs look like when they enter System 2? And we know from the Gilbert piece that we read for today that there are there are various ways in which these experiences, or there are various debates about how these beliefs look when they come into system 2. So I want to start, first of all, by thinking at a more basic level about our classificatory relationship to the world. How do we, what are our thoughts about the world like? How do we experience objects in the world from a kind of cognitive perspective? And so I want us to think first about classifying objects. And I'm going to give you a kind of example. If you were here with me, I would present this example to you, but I'm going to show this to you, and I want you to classify this object. So I want you to think to yourself, what is this thing that I'm about to show you? Okay, so we've just seen this guy before, right? And presumably when you thought of this animal, or when you saw this animal, when I asked you to classify it, you classified it as a dog. So now a natural kind of question comes up. Well, what does that amount to? What does it mean to think of something as a dog, or to classify a certain kind of animal as a dog? What does it mean to categorize an object into a particular category? And essentially there are two kinds of ways of thinking about content, thinking about the way in which we classify objects. So one is what philosophers call broad content, psychologists as well. And so the idea here would be that essentially you have the broad content dog. You're able to think of dog in this kind of broad content way if you're able to identify this dog and other dogs, if you're able to distinguish this dog from cats and so on. So really when we think about broad content, we're thinking about how you use that object, how you use your concept of that object, like how you can sort objects in the world, how you can use the concept to point to the thing when it's out there in the world, and so on. All of that is kind of the broad content aspect behind the concept. But also when we talk about concepts, we can sometimes think of the narrow content. And so what we mean by narrow content is essentially being able to think about the different properties that the dog has, right? So not only can I, if I have a dog concept, pick out the dogs in my environment, that would be to use this concept in a broad content way, but I can also say things about dogs. I could say, well, dogs are four-legged, they have floppy or pointy ears, they bark, they smell when they get wet, and so on. So all of that is kind of the narrow content that's associated with the concept dog, right? So the concept dog, the broad content is all the stuff that's outward looking. It goes out into the world, allows us to sort and identify the thing. That's why it's called broad, because it's extending out from me. And then the narrow content is just the things that are sort of within me, the ideas that I associate with the dog. So when we talk about content, or when we talk about concepts, we're going to distinguish these two things. And indeed, psychologists, philosophers, cognitive scientists in general have sometimes approached concepts by thinking of their broad content, and sometimes by thinking of their narrow content. Presumably, these are just two aspects of what our mental concepts are like. So what does it look like to think about the broad content of a concept? Well, if you're thinking of a concept as primarily from the point of view of its broad content, then you're thinking of concepts primarily as categories. They allow us to categorize objects in the world. That's kind of essential to them. So there's a natural kind of question that would arise if you're thinking of concepts in this way. And that is, well, what does it mean to categorize objects under different concepts? Or how do we go about categorizing objects? Do we do it by using specific rules of inclusion? So you might think that I have like a kind of specific definition that I employ when I think about whether something's a dog. I think it has to have 4 legs, for example, be hair covered, barking, and so on. But then, you know, sometimes dogs violate some of these rules. So maybe it's not like every one of the rules has to be met. There are specific questions that would arise here if you're thinking of the broad content of concepts as being given or realized by thinking about specific rules of what counts the dog. Another kind of approach is when we are trying to decide or categorize objects in our environment as particular things. If I'm trying to decide whether or not this item is this entity in my environment is a dog, then some theorists have suggested the way that we do that is that we have in our mind certain exemplary or primary instances of dogs. Like we have this kind of idea of like the dog within our mind. Like maybe that is an actual dog that we've experienced, or maybe it's some kind of like amalgam of the various dogs we've experienced. But in any way, this is like kind of like our prime example of a dog. And then we're trying to identify whether objects in our environment are dogs or not. What we're doing is we're essentially comparing that to that exemplary item. And if they share enough of their properties with that exemplar, then we will think of them as dogs. Yet another approach says that essentially the way in which we decide whether something falls under a certain category is that we have a kind of weighted feature list built into our head. So maybe if we're thinking about something being a dog, there are certain features that matter more to that list than others. So maybe if it's four-legged, that's a big point in favor it's being a dog. But if it has long hair, maybe that's only a small point in favor. That's not so important. There are short-haired dogs, there are hairless dogs, and so on. So the idea would be that there's a kind of tipping point and that some features are more important than others. And once you rack up enough of the features, you tip over into doghood. And that's essentially how our minds end up categorizing different objects as dogs. But all of these different theories about how the conceptual system works have been explored, have been investigated. There's no consensus yet on how we are able to categorize things, but each of these are in some sense going theories. How might we figure out which of these theories is true? Well, there are various ways that we can do this. We might focus on animal or infant learning paradigms, and we can use reinforcement to see how quickly these different, how quickly animals or infants are able to learn categories using the concept. So, what about the other side of the coin? What do we do about narrow content? How do we handle content that, the kind of content that's associated with the inward-looking picture, the content that is the ideas we associate with a particular category? Well, there are various different theories that have put forward here. Some people have who have been thinking about the narrow content of concepts, have essentially viewed a concept as a continuing developing schema. So this is called the theory of concepts. So the idea is that in effect, my concept of dog, if we thinking of it again from the narrow content point of view, consists of all these ideas I have of dogs. And that concept may continue to grow over time as I have more and more dog experiences, right? More and more experiences with dogs. Or maybe I become a veterinarian. I learned some things about dog behavior and the physical structures of dogs. Like all of that is going to add to a kind of continually expanding schema for dogs that we might have over life. And of course, I'm just using dogs as an example here. This would be for all of our concepts. So like, you know, if you have a concept of democracy, maybe that changes and grows over time. But the basic idea is that from the narrow content perspective of our concepts, there's a theory that's there, and that theory can continue to develop, and it may differ from person to person. Another view says that, in effect, a concept is a word meaning, right? So the idea would be that what a concept is just a kind of specific definition that is associated with that word, right? You know, our concept of dog may be something like the kind of biological species concept of dog containing its relations. And the idea would be that within our linguistic system, like, you know, within your mind, your conceptual schema for language has a kind of meaning associated with dog, and that is going to be this specific narrow content of dogs. So that's just a little bit to say about some of the work on concepts, right? Concepts are very useful because presumably lots of animals have concepts for different objects in their environment, even though they may not have something as full-fledged as a belief. I think you know, a lot of good work has been spent studying how concepts function. And if you want to learn more about that work, you can talk to me about it. But when we come to human beings, right, we may think there's something richer than simply concepts, so that humans don't maybe simply pick out items in their world, but they can have beliefs about them. So what does it mean to say that humans have more than concepts, to say they have beliefs? Well, let's think first of all about a simple concept user. So consider, for example, a frog. A frog may have, or this frog may have, a concept of a moth, right? What makes us think that the frog has a concept of a moth? Well, it's because he can interact with this object in its environment, right? So if it sees this object in its environment, the frog will perform certain kinds of characteristic actions. So it'll do something like this, right? And eat that moth, okay? So a frog maybe has a concept of a moth, or concept of bug, or maybe just concept of food. But in having that concept, it doesn't have sort of a distinction between the reality of the trigger of that concept being there and it merely appearing as though that object is there. If the frog has, if there is an environment in the frog's, or if there is an object in the frog's environment that triggers that frog concept in their mind, it seems like there is a characteristic behavioral pattern that the frog performs. You know, it sticks out its tongue and grabs that thing, right? The frog doesn't really think about this in any rich way. Presented with the object, having the concept triggered, it just responds in an appropriate way. And presumably animals function like this. We know that it just sort of responds in this way because different items can trigger this behavior from the frog. So for example, you can trigger a frog's tongue reflex and cause it to eat an item such as a BB by throwing that item in front of the frog like a moth. If you do this, you can continually do it. So you could throw BB after BB in front of the frog, and it will continue to eat them until it's finally a little bean bag full of BBs within it, or you know, just like small little pellets inside of it. You know, the frog's concept is incorrigible. It can't sort of change what happens when that concept is triggered. The concept is triggered and we have action. But humans have something richer. We have, again, something that we might call beliefs. So what are those? Well, look, I can look at a dog and there isn't one specific action pattern that's tied to it. I may look at this dog and think there is a dog. I may think the dog is a golden retriever. I may think the dog is happy. But in each of these instances, they involve that same kind of concept, the concept of the item and the environment, right? But I attribute different properties to that thing. So not only do we have, for us, a kind of trigger of a concept and attached behavior to that thing, instead, we can consider the item that we have a concept for from various different perspectives and attribute different traits to that item, right? And so it looks like we can have something richer than simply a tag on the thing. We can entertain objects from a certain point of view. We can, in other words, believe things about objects in our environment. So what is belief? Well, a kind of influential position, one that's assumed in the reading for today, is that belief consists of a proposition and an attitude, okay? So what does this mean? So basically, the thought is that for belief, there is a proposition. So that's just the specific content that is specified. So for example, in some of our previous examples, it might be something like the dog is a golden retriever. Maybe the dog is named Fido. Those would be kind of propositional contents. And then the thought is that that towards those kinds of sentences or things that attribute a kind of property to an object, that predicate a property of an object, to those predications of properties to objects, we bear an attitude of acceptance. So if I believe, for example, that dog is a golden retriever, then there's a predication to the dog. A predication simply means there's a predicate that's affixed to the concept dog, such that it says dog is a golden retriever. And then I bear the attitude of acceptance to that thing. I accept that that sentence, the dog is a golden retriever, is true. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about these propositional attitudes. And I say propositional attitudes because in effect, beliefs are viewed as one variety of propositional attitudes, but the thought is that there are others. So here's a little chart that can run through some of these. So these might be various kinds of attitudes that you adopt to different propositions. So you might have the propositional attitude of expectation. That's what's in the first row there. You might have the propositional attitude of doubting. You might have the propositional attitude of considering that something is the case. So in each of these cases, the thought is that we can factor each of these propositional attitudes into a proposition and a particular attitude that a particular agent takes towards that proposition, right? So if I believe that I'll get a job when I graduate, for example, I adopt the attitude of acceptance towards the proposition that I will get a job upon graduation. But if I expect to get a job when I graduate, then perhaps I have an attitude of anticipation towards that same proposition. So the idea is that when we're talking about propositional attitudes, we can factor them into these two components, the proposition and the attitude we take towards that thing. Belief is one variety of propositional attitude. When we believe something, we take the attitude of acceptance. But there are other kinds of propositional attitudes as well, and those will be distinguished by the kind of attitude that we take towards the proposition under consideration. Now, the reading for today from Gilbert is looking at how is it, or how does System 1 realize propositional, or how does how does the mind form beliefs? What is the structure of belief formation like? How does a mental system believe, in other words, as the article is titled? And essentially, Gilbert considers two kinds of views of how a mental system believes. So one of these views is called the Cartesian view. And essentially what this view says is, and this may strike us as kind of the intuitive view of how belief formation works, this view says, in effect, when you form a belief, there are a few different processes you have to go through. First of all comes comprehension of the claim that is being made. So if someone tells me there's a gray cat behind the bed, I first have to comprehend what is said. I have to comprehend the idea of a gray cat being behind a bed. And then I need to consider the evidence for that claim, right? So first is just understanding the claim that's made. And then I, being a competent believer, sort of consider what is the evidence for that claim. And then ultimately, I may accept or reject that claim. So the idea is that we first comprehend what people say. We then consider whether or not we should accept what they've said. And ultimately, we either accept that thing or reject it. And if we accept the claim that was made, then we have formed a belief. Gilbert uses a library metaphor here to describe how this functions. So he says, okay, well, consider a library that consists of a set of books. According to the Cartesian view, these books come in unmarked, right? So we don't know yet. The library, right, has fiction and nonfiction sections, but the librarian, who we can think of as sort of the belief former, the belief formation system, it receives the claims that are made, right? Maybe imagine someone telling you something. The claim that we arrive at here may be arrived at through a understanding of what they said using our linguistic system. Or, you know, maybe I come to believe that there's a gray cat behind the bed by seeing his tail sticking out, right? So in that case, I would come to the idea that there is a gray cat behind the bed through vision, but in some way, like a claim is becomes present to us through underlying systems. We then, as system 2, consider the evidence in favor of those claims. So according to the Cartesian view that Gilbert discusses, we, in effect, consider, you know, we, the system 2, is the one that considers the various evidence. Then ultimately, we either accept or reject that claim. So the thought here is, well, for the library, right, we're thinking here of the library as the repository of all our beliefs and the things we doubt. So for the library, the books come in, that is comprehension of the claims. And then we, the librarian, we have to consider these claims that have been sent to us, these books that have been sent to us, and decide which ones are fiction and which ones are nonfiction. And we will end up marking the books according to that. So here we might think that the green books are nonfiction. Those are the things we end up believing. But we mark some of the claims that have arrived as fiction, or some of the books that have arrived as fiction. We don't trust some things that are said to us, and so we reject those. So that's the basic Cartesian view. The other view that Gilbert considers is the view he favors, which he calls the Spinozan view. And so according to the Spinozan view, in effect, comprehension and acceptance are not two different acts. The idea is that when we hear something, we don't sort of just hear the claim that is being made from a kind of neutral point of view, but instead, in comprehending a statement, we accept that that statement is true. So that's kind of built into the same act. The act of comprehension is an act of acceptance. It's an act of coming to believe a certain thing. Now, the thought here is that system 2 arrives at, or what goes into system 2 is a comprehended and accepted claim. In other words, a belief. So system 1 generates things that are believed from the environment. Maybe I hear someone say a certain thing and my linguistic modules translate that thing. Well, what is coming out of that linguistic system is going to be a belief. I'm going to end up believing a certain thing based upon understanding what was said. I'm not going to merely understand what is said. I'm also going to accept it at the same instance. Now, once it's within system 2, I may consider evidence for that claim, right? Remember, everything that's coming in is something that's believed. But now I can think about that thing that has been given to me by the environment, the thing I've come to believe, and I can consider whether there really is good evidence for it. Maybe I take some time to do this, and if I think that there is not good evidence for it, then I may end up doubting that thing that I previously believed, or else I may come to believe it even more strongly. I may certify that belief. So if we want to spin out the library metaphor for this picture, the idea here would be that when the books come into the library, they are already marked when the books come into the library, they are all at first simply believed. So all books are treated as nonfiction when they first come in. And then we may specifically consider individual books and decide that those books are fiction. And when we do that, we put labels on them to mark them as being fiction, as being doubted. But of course, that itself is an effortful activity, and the presumption will be that whatever comes in is true. It is something that is believed. Okay, now Gilbert is a proponent of the Spinozan view, but it may seem a little strange to us. I think that bias is in favor, or we're biased in favor of the Cartesian view. And so why is that? Well, Gilbert spends a little bit of time talking about this, but the basic thought is, well, you know, if we wanted to build a system that behaved rationally and behaved in a good way, then we would build it such that things were merely entertained at first, and only subsequently, once we've identified enough evidence, did we come to believe those things, right? It seems like to us that that would be a kind of rational way to go. You know, presumably, like when we built computers, we've thought of them as having like evidence that can be accessed in these variety of different ways. So it looks like, you know, when we've been designing these computers, we've been thinking of them as having just basic information that can then be used by different systems within them. So that seems to show our bias in favor of the Cartesian view. But in fact, Gilbert thinks there's lots of evidence for the Spinozan view, and that should be the view we should accept. We should accept that things are merely believed in the first instance, and then subsequently and with effort doubted, if they are doubted at all. So Gilbert considers several different kinds of evidence in favor of the Spinozan view. So some of this evidence is developmental in nature, which means that it's acquired from examining how children come to form beliefs over time. How does the belief system develop within children? Gilbert also considers breakdown in a cognitive system. So he looks at the way in which cognitive load can interact with doubt, or can interact with simply believing a thing. He looks also at linguistic evidence. So how do we talk about belief and doubt? And he finds some evidence here, excuse me, for suggesting some evidence from linguistic studies for suggesting also that the Spinozan view is correct. So some of this is simply looking at the words that we use for belief and disbelief. So looking at marked uses for these types of words. I'll say more about what that is in a minute. And then some of it is through linguistic studies. And there's a very subtle study that's discussed here, a very interesting study that we'll talk about in a minute. And then finally, I think some evidence comes from evolution. Gilbert thinks there's a very good story to tell for why belief or for why we would comprehend and believe at the same time, and not merely comprehend claims and then subsequently decide whether or not we believe those things or not. All right, so let's look at some of this evidence. Let's start with developmental evidence. All right, so the basic idea here is, if we think about these two views, the Cartesian view and the Spinozan view, they're both suggesting that there's a first stage to belief formation, a second stage, and then a third stage. So the Spinozan view, right, says that the first stage, we comprehend and accept a claim. That is, we believe a claim. Right, so when someone says something to us, when we see something in our environment, that leads us to believe things. So the idea is that if you hear someone say a certain thing, in understanding what was said, you already accept what they said. So that's the first stage. You believe something when you hear it or when you see evidence for it. And the idea is that everything you hear is at first believed, okay, and has to only be effortfully unbelieved. So stage one is just believing things that are presented to you from your environment. Stage two, you may go on to consider the evidence, right? So you as an individual, having accepted this claim that you heard initially, at least a little bit, may subject that claim to rational consideration later and consider evidence for it. And then ultimately, you may certify or doubt that claim. Those are the three stages, right? The Cartesian view, on the other hand, says that we merely comprehend a claim, then consider evidence for it, and then ultimately, we come to form a belief by accepting that claim. or if we reject it, we don't form a belief. So for both of these views, there's something that happens first, right? And then there's something that happens next, and then something that happens third. So presumably, if we think about children developing, the idea is that maybe stage 1 stuff and stage 2 stuff and stage 3 stuff all develops at the same time. But if not, you can't have stage 2 first, right? In other words, you must have whatever happens at stage 1 before you develop the capacity to have stage 2, or at the same time as you develop the capacity to have stage 2, right? You know, if you can't consider evidence for a claim unless you can comprehend that claim in the first place, right? And since comprehending the claim is on both of these models built into stage 1, then presumably children have to learn to do the stage 1 stuff before the stage 2 stuff, right? So if children have, and so what prediction does this give us for developmental studies about children and belief? Well, essentially what this tells us is that if children have the ability to merely comprehend a claim, but not to accept it, then that's evidence for Descartes, right? If we see children like comprehending lots of things, but being skeptical or dubious about them, then that would be evidence that in fact we can comprehend claims before we accept them. The comprehension is kind of the basic component. But what do we see? And again, if children accept everything first, right, if that's their tendency, if we find that young children, young language users accept everything you tell them and only later develop the ability to doubt it, then that's some evidence for the Spinozan view. It suggests that in comprehending the items, they also believe them, right? So what do we see? Well, I just love this quote that Gilbert uses from Thomas Reid. So Thomas Reid writes about children that if credulity were the effect of reasoning and experience, it must grow up and gather strength in the same proportion as reason and experience do. But if it is the gift of nature, it will be strongest in children and limited and restrained by experience. And the most superficial view of human life shows that the last is really the case and not the first, right? So what is credulity? Credulity is the tendency to believe. And so what is Reid saying here? He's saying that if the tendency to believe were the effect of reasoning and experience, as the Cartesian view says, it says our basic thing is just comprehension. And then we are able, as we grow, to come to believe things, right? So again, it says, if belief were the effect of reasoning and experience, it must grow up and gather strength in the same proportion as reason and experience do. But if it is the gift of nature, it will be the strongest in children and limited and restrained by experience, right? So if believing is innate, then children will tend to believe more often, and we'll only find that belief is limited and restrained as we grow. And it's certainly true, I can speak from firsthand experience, that children are easy to fool. They tend to believe everything that's said to them. So it looks like belief is a kind of primitive attitude, and we only develop the capacity to doubt things or to mount evidence to doubt things as we grow older and develop our system 2 rational consideration aspect, our ability to doubt things, right? Okay, so that's developmental evidence. Let's turn now to look at breakdown. So breakdown is kind of a similar story to the developmental evidence. So the idea here is, if we look at these systems, right, again, there's sort of like a conveyor belt or an assembly line. So first, right, we have to do a certain thing. We either have to comprehend a claim or comprehend and accept it. Then we have to do this other thing, consider evidence. And then we can either, on the Spinozan view, certify or doubt this thing, or on the Cartesian view, or accept or reject it. I should say one quick thing about the Spinozan view, because I think I've been talking a little loose about this. But the basic idea behind the Spinozan view is that we will not always consider evidence for the things we believe. And when we don't, we'll just keep on believing those things, okay? considering evidence is kind of optional in the Spinozan view. I guess it is in the Cartesian view too, but the idea would be that in coming to believe, right, we have to consider evidence first. So, okay, if belief formation does function in this way, if it is like an assembly line, well, then just like we can hit the button and stop the assembly line and see where the car is at that point and what the car looks like and get some sense of how the assembly line works from that, then we can do the same thing for belief. We can interrupt the system's processing and make it generate a premature output. And if we do that, then we'll see how it goes about constructing belief, right? So if we can break in between stage 1 and stage 2, and we see that what was there was something that was believed, then that would be evidence for the Spinozan view. If it was merely a comprehended claim, then that would be evidence for the Cartesian view. And now, how do we interrupt the system's processing? How do we hit that button on the assembly line? Well, one way to interrupt a system's processing, a human system, is to deplete that individual of their overall cognitive resources. So we can look at a couple of different examples here. So one would be the example of sleep deprivation. These are Guantanamo Bay prisoners. These are former Al-Qaeda members undergoing here sleep deprivation, interrogation, or torture, depending on your point of view. In effect, it's long been the practice of United States intelligence and many other intelligence systems around the world to use sleep deprivation as a method for interrogation. During the Bush years, with the enhanced terrorism technique, so typically for the United States, a typical interrogation technique will have the people who are being be sleep deprived no more than 72 hours. But after 9/11, the enhanced terrorism or torture techniques, interrogation techniques, allowed this time limit to go above that, and that was called enhanced interrogation. Okay, so sleep deprivation is an important tool of military interrogators. It's an important way of getting them to tell that different items are true. And so in these cases, why is this important? Well, it's important because you break down the cognitive load, so you make it so that they cannot block themselves from saying what is believed to be true, right? Another way in which this is used is people can use sleep deprivation to cause enemy combatants who are being interrogated to accept claims that they wouldn't initially accept. So what's happening here? Well, we're causing the system to break down, and it looks like what we get in that instance is acceptance. Another kind of example here would be the example of this is Bo Bergdahl. He was an Army Special Forces person who was captured by Al-Qaeda when he was doing something a little sketchy, leaving his camp at a weird time. He was subsequently held by the Taliban was who he was captured by. He was subsequently held in Taliban imprisonment for an extended period of time. He was ultimately rescued. But he was made to say things contrary to the United States and reported that his actual views started to kind of shift to that point. Another way in which this technique is used is some intelligence systems will deprive people of food, water, rest, and then after some time, ask them to just write a statement against the United States. It doesn't have to be what you really believe, but if you do this, I'll give you this nice like little pudding cup. Maybe they have like a little pudding cup there. Well, at this point, of course, the individual is quite tired, quite hungry. And so they go along with this. They think, what's the damage of just writing this thing? and then they're given the pudding cup, right? Well, when that happens, it seems that the individual actually comes to believe the thing that they've written down. Bo Bergdahl as well actually reported again that he came to believe some of the items that he was made to say by the Taliban, right? So in these instances, when we break down the system, then it comes to simply believe whatever it hears in or whatever is presented to it in its environment at that instance. Okay, so so far we've seen that if we break down the system through sleep deprivation, it will tend to believe things that are given to it, that are given to the system. We've seen that children, right, are credulous. They tend to believe everything that's told to them from the beginning. So it's looking like stage one involves belief and not simply comprehension. Let's look too at some linguistic evidence that Gilbert presents that points in the same direction. So there are two kinds of evidence that I'm going to discuss here. So one of these involves marked use. So what is marked use? Well, the basic idea here is that there are certain kinds of words. So there are words that have a base word. There are base words, and then there are words that involve a certain marking or additional component to that word. And so operating in the background before we get into this data is this idea that, this sort of principle of psycholinguistic research, which is research into the psychology of language, that complexity of expression equals complexity of thought, right? So if a particular expression is more complex than another, then the idea is that that former expression, the more complex one, involves more thought to produce. It is reflective of a more effortful thought process. So turning to marked words versus unmarked words, right? So the idea here would be, you know, if you think about a marked word like, or if we think about a word like happy, an unmarked word or a marked word associated with the unmarked word happy. Sorry, let me start over there. If we think of an unmarked word like happy, which is a base word, we can't take anything off of that to generate any simpler, shorter words. And then we think of a marked word that is associated with happy, something like unhappy. We can think of that unhappy seems to suggest more cognitive complexity. So what is the idea here? Basically the idea is that marked words have more morphemes than unmarked, right? So unhappy is marked, happy is not. And so the idea is that happiness is a kind of easier idea to understand than unhappiness. Happiness itself is more basic than unhappiness. And then another point is that unmarked words can be used neutrally, whereas marked words cannot, right? So I can say, how happy are you? And that does not imply that you're happy at all. You may be not happy at all in that case. But if I say, how unhappy are you? Well, that implies some level of unhappiness, right? So these marked words cannot be used neutrally, whereas unmarked words can, okay? And so there's evidence, or actually if we think about our words for belief, it seems clear that marked uses are all pointing at things related to doubt and not to mere belief, right? So according to the Spinozan view, unacceptance is a more complex cognitive process than mere acceptance. And indeed, unacceptance is a marked word. It involves an addition to the more morphemically simple acceptance, right? So it seems then that unacceptance, that this reflects that acceptance is more basic, is easier, and unacceptance is the more difficult concept. And this follows too for a lot of our belief words. So, right, unacceptable, disbelief, incorrect, inaccurate, all have more morphemes than their antonyms: acceptable, belief, correct, and accurate. So presumably these aspects of disbelief and unacceptance are more complex, are harder ideas for us to entertain. So the thought is that they are more cognitively rich in some way. Acceptance words, and also it seems that acceptance words admit of neutral uses, right? I can say, how accurate do you find this claim, right? And you may not find it accurate at all in that case, right? If I'm saying, how accurate do you find this claim? It's perfectly reasonable for you to respond, I don't find it accurate at all. But if I say, how unacceptable do you find his claim? Then there's a presumption there that you do find it unacceptable. You might have to say in that case, what do you mean, how unacceptable do you find it? I love it, right? If you do find it acceptable. So both of these cases seem to suggest that, that acceptance is more basic than unacceptance. In other words, believing is more basic than doubting. Additional linguistic evidence is given by experimental studies on using linguistic stimuli. So one famous example discussed in your reading is the example of reading or hearing the denial of a claim. And in a study that's discussed in your reading, it's shown that merely reading or hearing the denial of a claim leads one to accept the claim itself. So if you're presented, for example, with the sentence, Bob Talbert is not linked to the mafia, then you will be more likely to accept the claim that Bob Talbert is linked to the mafia, right? So the presence of the negation there gets ignored. And you know, if we think about the kind of understanding of the sentence, Bob Talbert is not linked to the mafia, well, in effect, that involves a negation of an idea, but having read so you have to understand the idea that Bob Talbert is linked to the mafia and then deny that thing. Well, in thinking Bob Talbert is linked to the mafia, if the Spinozan view is correct, then you not only entertain that idea, but you also believe it a little bit, right? And so even in having the negation claim, the belief itself is reasserted. And we find that when people read this, Bob Talbert is not linked to the mafia, then they are more inclined, they actually have some tendency to accept that he is in the mafia, because to understand that sentence, they also had to read the sentence, Bob Talbert is linked to the mafia. This is actually kind of related to a strategy that Donald Trump has that he uses on the campaign trail. So Trump on the campaign trail uses this technique called paralipsism. And I'll just read you a quote here that I have. Oops, where did that go? Sorry, I have it written in here. So paralepsis is essentially a rhetorical technique that someone uses when they don't want to be held responsible for a particular claim they make. So in paralipsis, the speaker will introduce a topic or argument by saying he doesn't want to talk about it. In truth, he or she wants to emphasize that very thing. So here's an example. In New Hampshire on December 1, this is December 1 of 2019, Trump said, this is actually during 2016, Trump said, but all of the other candidates are weak, and they're just weak. I think they are weak generally, if you want to know the truth. But I don't want to say that because I don't want to have any controversies. No controversies, is that okay? So I refuse to say that they are weak generally, okay? So in this instance, Trump is denying a certain thing in a sense, but he's causing us to believe or to entertain that idea, and that leads us to believe the thing which he himself is denying, right? So again, this is an example where something's being said is sufficient for our coming to believe that thing. And this again is evidence for the Spinozan view. So this is just a little bit of the evidence that Dan Gilbert considers in his article. But we may face a particular question at this point. So suppose that some of the evidence he has presented is good evidence for the idea that belief formation works in this way, that we actually, when we entertain something someone said, or when we look out into the world, we simply form beliefs about the way things are, and we don't just comprehend claims that then have to be effortfully believed after the fact. So suppose that is the case, well, then we can ask ourselves, well, why would belief work this way? Why would systems that simply believe everything that they come in contact with come to exist, rather than systems that maybe consider ideas more carefully before they reach a conclusion that things are a certain way? Well, essentially what Gilbert says here is he asks us to think of simple organisms. So think of an organism such as a bee, right? Well, they perceive, right? They perceive the world around them, sort of like the frog we were considering earlier. And their perception ends, the bee's perception ends in an apprehension of the world, right? Bees don't have an appearance reality distinction. If things appear a certain way, that's how the bees understand them to be. So concept tokening is identification of a stimuli. So concept tokening, like we talked about earlier. And it simply implies the existence of the stimuli, right? So if I'm a mere concept tokener and not a believer, then when I see items in my environment, I entertain that they are the thing I am attributing or I'm understanding them as, and I don't like have room for doubt that they're not actually that thing. So if the bee, right, thinks pollen, then it entails the presence of pollen. The bee doesn't have an appearance reality distinction. If it's presented with pollen, then it thinks there's some pollen. So it's unlikely that there is a comprehension of a proposition and then acceptance generating belief, right? If our belief systems are built out of perception, out of these perceptual systems that bees have, then it doesn't seem likely that there is some perception and then we have to accept that thing in order to believe it. So if perception is primitive, if there are more perceivers amongst the animal kingdom than believers, right, then seeing would presumably be believing for those perceivers. And if perception takes for granted that the world is how it is perceived, then it's only natural that when you come to systems that are capable of the cognitive richness of believing, belief is sort of the primitive state. Belief comes first. Disbelief then would be a kind of higher cognitive capacity. It would be something that's evolutionarily and developmentally later and more effortful to deploy. So these evolutionary considerations also seem to support Gilbert's view. And so where does this leave us? Well, we can see the disputes such as this one about we can see that a dispute such as this one about belief is really a dispute about where to locate cognitive capacities in our developing model, right? So on the Cartesian view, believing is in part a system 2 process, right? Understanding a claim is a system 1 process, but then we have to go through this kind of effortful work of considering the evidence for that claim that's been presented to us by system 1, and then ultimately we can come to believe that thing based upon our system 2 consideration of evidence. But on the Spinozan view, believing is system 1, right? So what comes into system 2 is just belief. And then ultimately we can have reconsideration within system 2 of those beliefs. All right, so that's it for the discussion on beliefs. We will be turning next time to look at emotions, and I'll be seeing you later this week. Goodbye.